Hello everyone and welcome to episode 2 of Board with Each Other, the podcast that looks at board gaming through the lens of playing as a couple, or with a friend you regularly play with, or with a board gaming buddy with benefits. Whatever your setup, we are the podcast for you. I'm joined today by my co-host, lovely wife and player 2, Hannah Kelly.
And board game friend with benefits, apparently. Hi guys.
I'm your host, Alister Simpson, and today we are going to be talking about Scythe. Scythe, how's it pronounced?
Scythe.
Is it Scythe or is it Scythe?
I don't know, I think you say it weird. Scythe. Death has a scythe.
It's the GIF thing all over again, isn't it?
GIF, obviously.
So, what is Scythe? Scythe, in essence, is a area control game. So your board is your map, basically, and you have to essentially accumulate victory points through the course of the game. The victory points are represented by money. So you have money that you sort of start with and that you earn throughout the game, but then at the end of the game, depending on what you've done in the board state, you get awarded additional money, and that ends up being your victory point total. How the game actually plays is you choose one of 5 factions based in a alternate history 1920s where the First World War was fought with mechs as opposed to in trenches. And
that's how it was fought though, wasn't it?
I think so, yeah. I need to probably brush up on my history a bit.
Giant mechs, that's the thing.
Yeah. So you pick one of the 5 factions loosely based on sort of Eastern European nations. And with that faction, you get a player mat, but you also get another player mat, which goes below that, which is your type. So you've got things like industrialist or agriculturalist. And that has a significant impact on gameplay. So it is an asymmetrical game. Not all the factions are the same. They all have their own sort of special abilities and special ways of doing things. And essentially, they all play in roughly the same way. So on your turn, you select basically one of 4 paths on the bottom mat. So you have top actions and bottom actions. And essentially, you pick one to do on that turn, and the following turn, with the exception of the Russviet faction, you would have to pick something else, so you can't do the same action twice in a row. The actions, the top actions are move, so you basically move your people around the map. You produce, so depending on where you have areas under your control, you would produce resources or more workers, which again allow you to spread out more and gain even more resources. You can trade, which allows you to exchange money for, again, resources. Or you could bolster, which basically improves the amount of power you can bring into play when you end up in conflict.
I think of it as like an in-game currency almost.
Yeah, I mean, there's several sort of in-game currencies. There's the money itself, which are victory points. There is the resources that you have. There is popularity, so a measure of how much your people like you, which is exceptionally important because it dictates how many victory points you get at the end of the game for each of the things that you have. And there is power, which again goes back to when you come into conflict. After you do that, you can then take a bottom action in the same lane as such, and the bottom actions basically involve you spending your resources to do certain things in the game. So either building mechs, of which you have 4, or you can build structures, which all over have their own individual effects. You can enlist, Hannah's favourite.
Oh, enlisting. Yeah, we'll get to that.
We'll get to that in a minute, which basically involves moving cubes around your mats, and they all have different benefits. And the final one, which is upgrade, which basically allows you to upgrade your maps, your mat, should I say. So all of the actions that you take start having additional benefits. So, for example, you produce, but you'd also start getting more resources, or you do a bolster action, which would net you more power than before, for example. You also have a leader miniature on the board, and the leader miniature allows you to collect objective tokens. So when you collect an objective token, you don't get anything in sort of victory points, but you draw from a separate deck that gives you a thematic encounter where you have a choice of 3 options, and you know some of them you usually the first option is quite good, but then you have 2 other ones which have a payoff. So you'll either spend money to do something or sacrifice popularity in order to achieve achieve something. Not a huge amount of theme or text on there, but they're quite fun, and they had
quite amusing.
Yeah, they had a bit of sort of random element to it. The only other thing to really mention that's very important is in the centre of the board there is a hex called the Factory. The factory is vitally important. When you move there, you basically get to draw a factory card, which gives you a 5th choice in top and bottom actions each turn. The first one there gets to choose from the 2, look at both, and it is worth 3 times that of a normal hex at the end of the game.
So if you control it, so if you've got a mech on it or a worker or something like that, then you would get 3 times.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess at that point, where the factory usually comes into play is towards the end of the game where people are vying for control. And that brings me to combat. We have miniatures on a board, which makes me think I'm going to be, invading things and chucking dice and what have you. Combat in Scythe is quite a brief, muted affair. You basically have combat cards. Each faction has a certain number of them. They all have a value of from 2 to 5 on them. And you have a dial. When you go into combat, you select a value from the dial, which is how much of your power you spend in that combat, and you get to combine that with a combat card. You do
sometimes more, depending on your faction and perks and stuff.
Yeah, or if you're attacking with multiple mechs or characters or whatever. You do that in secret, and then you reveal, and the higher number basically pays the cost and wins the combat. All that does is essentially send the loser back to their home square. You don't actually destroy each other's miniatures as such. And an important thing to mention, obviously, is how the game ends.
See, he mentions this for you. He never actually mentioned this for me the first time that we played. So when we normally play, Al sits at home and he'll read the rules, and then I will come in and he'll explain in Hannah Lee's, so in a way that I can really access it. Also means that we don't have to sit there and read the rules together. Mm-hmm. He explained all of this, but then never actually explained how to end the game, or even actually how to score the game. So consider yourself lucky.
So, dear listener, I'm about to do for you what I did not do for my wife. The game ends as you accomplish certain things in the game, and it can be things like bringing out all of your mechs, bringing out all your workers, reaching the maximum in certain tracks like the power and popularity tracks, etc. Every time you do one of those things, you have 6 stars and you place a star. You can't place a star multiple times on one objective as such. And as soon as 6 stars are placed, the game ends. So you as players basically have control over when you want to end the game. And those stars in themselves are worth quite a lot of victory points at the end of the game. So if you maneuver a way to basically get 6 stars down while the opponent has 2 or 3, you've given yourself a huge head start in the scoring at the end. But it's one of the things that does make the game quite interesting is that control element. And a lot of the tactical nous comes from controlling when the game ends, I've found. Final thing to mention, I guess, is how long it plays. In our experience, probably about an hour and a half to 2 hours, I would say.
Yeah, I reckon that's about right. We have had a couple of very quick games.
Yeah, as I said, by putting stars on the map really, really quickly, sometimes it can end quite quickly. But even when I say quickly, that was about an hour.
Or if you don't explain the rules to your wife and she's just faffing around.
Faffing around, yeah.
Well, you're merrily gaining stars.
So, Hannah, what were your first impressions of Scythe?
Well, not great, given that you didn't explain half the rules to me.
Well, there was one rule that I tried very, very hard to explain.
Oh, God, enlisting. It's like the bane of my life. I wake up in the middle of the night in cold sweats thinking about how to enlist.
I have taught Hannah many, many games over the years, but I've never seen her hit a mental block like she did with a particular rule from this, which is around one of those bottom actions where you enlist.
And I just want to say that I'm not stupid, okay? We play some really complicated games, and with lots of different things that you can do, but enlisting, I think, is just this complete mental blank. And even if I think about it now, it's kind of like this vague concept that I kind of get the point of it, and I still screw it up.
Okay, well, that aside, how did you find that it played when you first sort of got into it? And
yeah, so, I mean, my overall conclusion is it's not really one of my favourite games to play. I think there was definitely a learning curve. Not that I think it's particularly complex necessarily to play, but there's definitely a real learning curve about what the way to achieve your goals and your objectives and meet all of those. And so I definitely think that it was one of those things that we had to keep playing to kind of get my head round.
yeah. Yeah.
I wonder if they reskinned it with elves. It might be slightly better. I don't know.
Probably, knowing you.
Probably. Would I find it so difficult? I don't know. I mean, maybe there is a reskinned version with elves. I don't know. Let us know.
I'm sure there'll be one on the way.
And I'll give it a crack. Yeah. Maybe I'll prefer it. I don't know what you probably prefer it more than I do.
Yeah, I think that's safe to say. I think from the off I preferred it to you. I really like the asymmetrical nature of it. I like that the factions all play the same but different, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. There is gaps with the various factions where I imagine it's very, very finely balanced, and if you practiced and sort of got your head around the machine or the engine behind each of them, then they would all be as good as each other to a certain extent. But
also about play style as well. So again, we recently played a couple of nights ago in preparation for this, and I picked a new faction that neither of us have played with before.
Yeah.
And it definitely was oh shit, I can't do what I normally do.
Yeah.
And I think that probably screwed me over a little bit.
Yeah, very much so. I think some of them do take a few games to sort of get your head around what the benefits of their special ability are as such. But I think when you do get your head around it and your engine starts working as such, it's immensely satisfying. Mm-hmm. When everything can feel very, very abstract, but when it all clicks into place, I don't think there's something else in our collection that scratches that itch for me in the same way. There's a lot of moving parts, and when they align, it's very, very satisfying. Despite it being a competitive game, I think there is an element of you doing your own thing in this, and that might be very, very different if you're playing with more players. But as I said, combat is quite muted and doesn't net you a huge amount of benefit, and sometimes quite a lot of cost if it costs you popularity. So you can play through the majority of the game. In fact, you could theoretically play an entire game without coming into any conflict at all. Mm-hmm. You're very much sort of building your own engine.
And I think you feel a lot more confident with combat. I mean, that's your play style, whereas I tend not to. I tend to go for things like ball control and stuff like that. So actually, it's always you that's the aggressor, and actually I could quite happily play without ever crossing paths with you, and that'd be fun. I've got my side of the board, you got yours, you stay over there, stay in your lane.
I just can't help myself. If there's combat in a game, I will attack at some point. Yeah. But again, there's not aside from if you win a combat, you get an objective star, and you can actually do that twice. There's two slots for that as such. So the combat is more a useful tool for controlling when the game ends than it is for actually getting you much during the game. Obviously, there's the usual conflict over the factory, which is usually where you come into direct contact, or just to mess with somebody else's plans. If you attack a worker that's not protected by a mech, you immediately win, albeit at the cost of popularity. But it does mean you can essentially steal resources from somebody that way. So there's an element of that.
Yes, people have done that before to me.
Have they?
Yeah.
I think that takes us neatly on to the next topic I wanted to discuss, which is Hannah's a very, very good loser.
Thank you.
Not so much for Scythe.
No. Scythe, I suppose the main feeling that I think of when I think about Scythe is rage. It makes me really irrationally angry in a way that I don't think any other board game does.
No, I've never seen you get genuinely quite angry like I did with one particular game we had.
Oh, and it was all to do with fucking Enlisting as well.
I thought you were going to flip the board.
Oh, God, I got it wrong, and I think I screwed up my turn, and therefore potentially the game, and it just made me very cross.
Yeah, I think it might be a combination of the propensity for you to mess up. So if you don't sort of think a few turns ahead, you can really, really mess things up. Mm-hmm. But then in between that, you've got me rampaging around at a mech going, ha-ha, and attacking you, and I think that would just push you over the edge.
Yes, yes. I think I possibly threatened to divorce you.
I mean, that's a fairly common occurrence.
Yeah.
I think one thing I haven't mentioned is around expansions. We're playing the vanilla version, the vanilla retail version, so we haven't got any of the expansions. I know that there are several. There's one that just introduces a couple more factions. There's one that introduces airships as well as mechs, which apparently adds quite a significant tactical dimension to it, and is quite, if I remember reading correctly, quite popular with people who think it buoys up the combat a little bit, makes it a little bit more exciting. And then there's the biggie, which is Rise of Fenris, which is, as far as I understand, a 8-game campaign that you can play through. I'm not sure whether that works as sort of co-op or faux co-op versus an AI. I'm not entirely sure, but I know it is quite popular. It is something I might pick up at some point because I think it might add a missing dimension for us. But yeah, just to make it clear that we haven't played with any of the expansions. Would you be willing to go back to it with expansions, or you?
I mean, obviously it depends how much they cost. I definitely think that I'd definitely give a legacy style campaign a try. Additional factions, meh.
Yeah, okay, alright, so on that super enthusiastic note, I guess we should score it. Would you like to go first?
Alright, so first of all, this is like our general scoring. So components. In terms of components, I have to say it's probably one of the nicer box sets that I think we have. Everything comes with its own little containers. It came with baggies, which made you very happy.
Yes, yeah, I do like a game that comes already with baggies. I don't have to go and buy more.
I think the miniatures are also really nice. And you know what's amazing is it all fits neatly back in the box. Any other box we have with miniatures, I'm looking at our board game shelf now, it ends up sticking out like half an inch. This, not
Gloomhaven, I'm looking at you.
Oh my god, that's just, yeah.
Yeah.
But this all fits really neatly back in the box. And the board also, I think, is really good quality. Which
yeah, it is, yeah.
I'm kind of heartbroken the first time we bought Arkham Horror and we got it out, and I think we possibly broke the board the first time we played with it.
Yeah, quite possibly, yeah.
But it's a really nice, thick, sturdy board, so I like that.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think the miniatures for the faction leaders are great. They're nice. They're quite detailed. I was a little bit disappointed by the mech miniatures because I was expecting maybe something a little bit more bigger, detailed, and composing. I don't know.
It wouldn't have fitted in the box then.
Well, it would have just been a bigger box. I do like my miniatures. So that's the only bit I've got any issue with. The rest of the components are really, really good quality. I also like that it comes with plastic trays for the resources.
Yeah.
Which is really, it keeps it nice and neat when it's at the table. You don't have to come up with a sort of another solution for that. The player mats are also really well made. They're really sturdy. They're thick.
And it fits really nicely again, so it doesn't take up the entire room when we play. It fits quite nicely on our table. Like we don't have to pull the table out or anything like that. So
we don't have to get the full table out like we do for some of them.
And strip down and set up is really quick, actually.
Yeah, once you know what you're doing, you can get the box out and be playing within 10 minutes, which for a game of that complexity is actually quite nice. It sets up really, really, as long as you've got all your components separated in the right way, it sets up really quickly. Same with strip down. Perhaps takes slightly longer because you need to put everything back in its relative bags and whatnot, but yeah, it sets up very quickly. So what would you score it?
8.
I have scored it a 7, just for my vague amount of disappointment on the mech miniatures.
Alright, so what about complexity then?
Well, this is always an interesting one, isn't it? Because do we rate something that's complex highly, or do we rate something that's complex low? I think it's more around rating something low when we feel it's overly complex for the amount of fun you have. And we also look at things like the potential to argue about rules and analysis paralysis as such, and all that kind of thing. Yeah.
So I think the more impenetrable, the more difficult it is to get your head around for whatever reason, the lower you would score it. I think if it is suiting a need, if it works for you, even if it is that you like something that's quite complex, then
I think it's down to each of our personal preferences. I think there can be games that are overly complex that don't really serve the game as such, and that's what I think I would score low. Just because something's very, very complex and involved, I don't think I'd score that lowly. It's just like, is it worth it as such? So, what are your thoughts on Scythe around that?
Yeah. So I've got a lot of thoughts on Scythe about complexity. I've talked before about how I have analysis paralysis, and I think Scythe absolutely hits and triggers all my worst issues around AP. So what I would say is that your top action on what you can do, so move, produce, etc., that's fairly limited. And so in order for you to achieve any of your objectives or any of the things that you need to do to get your stars, you're going to have to take at least 4 or 5 turns to do. But actually you've got so many that you need to do that when you start out, it is just this huge big potential for what you could do, and I just get absolutely overwhelmed by it. I sit there and I'm like, well, where do I start? And I think then that I can do so little, certainly early on, before you've got any of your upgrades or you've enlisted. No, enlisted doesn't do that, does it? Okay, right. See, still I struggle with enlisting. It just means that I get stuck in my own head so very quickly.
Fair enough.
And for me, that's a problem, I think. What I'd also say as well is that we've played a lot of games that have got quite complex rules or have got rules where you take a series of actions and there are different phases to play. But what I would say is that for Scythe, I don't feel that there's a flow.
I would disagree with that. I think once
really?
I think once you get into the flow, there is definitely one there.
How on earth does building a monument have anything to do with trading?
Well, it doesn't, but obviously it has its what you choose to do on one turn has its impacts on another.
Yeah, see, I just feel like it's a bit disjointed. And that's probably why, I was thinking about this today, I think this is probably why I struggle with the whole concept of enlisting. Like, I feel like it's just this weird thing on its own. I've never really got, how does that relate?
It doesn't slot into the engine as such for you.
Yeah. And then you read this card and it says, this is like one of those bonus cards, objective cards, and it says, enlist to recruit. I'm like, what the fuck does that mean? And Al just sort of rolls his eyes at me. He's like, I know it means enlist. Like, it doesn't feel...
Joined up for you.
Joined up for me.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and I think that's obviously where we differ. I do agree with you around the start of the game and, what do I do? I think that wide open feel, but I think this speaks to a lot about how we play. I don't think about things an awful lot. I just do.
Yes.
But I think in some ways that actually helps me in this because I'm allowed to get off the traps quite quickly, and then I start making decisions based on where I'm at. And I don't get locked down and trying to weigh up options overly and so far with our games that's actually stood me in quite good stead, I think. Whereas I think you get a bit lost in your own head and start second guessing yourself, and because you're second guessing yourself you don't commit to something. And you start jumping and hopping around, which from what I've seen is poison in this. You will end up losing if you do that. You need to do something and then just commit to it.
Or actually I overcommit to it, and that's the thing, like, that is what I'm going to do. I'm going to build a mech and be damned, I'm going to build my goddamn mech regardless of how much that costs me and what,
and you won't deviate from that path, whereas perhaps you should. Okay. Alright, interesting. So how would you score it?
So I'm going to score it a 5. I don't think like the actual rules are really difficult. In fact, I would probably say that in terms of explaining it, aside from the fact I didn't explain how to win, it was probably one of the quicker games to explain, and I think it's very quick to get your head round. I think it's quite challenging to master and be really good at it, but for me it's the AP factor. Like, it's just, it blows my mind. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think the core rules are not actually that complicated. It's just there are so many variants and options. Not to the certain extent where you know those classic, like, really easy to pick up, hard to master games like Carcassonne, for instance. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that, but there is that element of it where it's more around the number of choices available to you than the actual core rules of the game. That are complex.
June, you know they have mentats?
Yes.
I'm not a fucking mentat.
Neither am I.
No, I know.
Yeah, so anyway, okay, alright. So you scored it a 5. I would give it a 7, personally. I understand the capacity for AP. I understand the complexity involved, but I for me personally, I think it flows quite well.
Yeah.
All right. Shelf life.
So I think, I mean, you may have picked up on this, it's not probably my favourite game in the whole wide world ever, therefore it's probably not the game that I'm going to automatically reach to. However, I do think there are lots of combinations, so you've got different factions that you can play. And I think even if you play the same faction but your opponent plays a different faction, well, actually that completely changes the board state as to whether you're next to each other and into combat lots. So I do think you could replay it lots. Whether I wanted to or not was a different question.
Okay. And what about sort of the value for money end of the spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, we've played, probably 7 or 8 games with
I
this
would
now,
say so. Yeah.
and I think it will stay in our rotation for a long time. It's just that we won't play it.
We're not going to go through a week where we play it like 5 times.
Yeah, that's never going to happen. Whereas with Marvel Champions, yes, absolutely, and it has.
Yeah, fine.
And we have.
Yeah. I mean, I think the replayability is there just because of the endless permutations and the board state. Although there are issues with that at 2-player, I think, which I'll get onto in the next section. I think I'll leave that aside. But you have got five factions with 5 different combinations of type that you can use. I think it was very good value for money for a game that included some miniatures. It was actually really cheap. Miniatures usually immediately boots games over like the sort of the £50-60 mark, and I think when I picked this up it was sub £50, which I thought was £50 for our American listeners, which I thought was reasonably good value. And I think for what you get in the box and the value of the components, I think that definitely does push it up for me.
Yeah.
So with that in regard, again, I gave it a 7.
So I gave it a 5, but I think that's more to do with how much I would want to replay it.
Yeah, which is fine. This is your personal score. That's fine.
Thanks.
Okay.
So fun. How much fun do you have playing it?
I have a lot of fun playing with it. I like this game. As I said before, I get an enormous amount of satisfaction from when things start clicking into place and working. So I'd probably say the second half of the game I find a lot more fun than the first. I think the first can feel a little bit rote at times, where you got to do things and you do them. But I think as the game opens up and it gets into its second half, and your engine starts running, I find that immensely satisfying.
Yeah, I don't. Kel Surprise. Again, maybe if we skinned it with elves, perhaps. But no, I definitely don't find it as fun. And I think what I also find really frustrating is, for example, the last game that we played, I made a series of poor choices early on. That screwed the entire game for me.
Yeah, that game was over a third of the way through it, wasn't it?
So after about 20 minutes, I was like, I fucked this. And I was like, I'm not going to quit because Al really likes playing this game and we're going to continue playing it. But also, like, kind of my heart was out of it, you know?
Yeah. Although I have to say, of the games we played, the 7 to 8 games we played, that's the only time I think that's happened. Most of the time, it's been a lot more difficult to tell who's winning. Yeah, actually,
I would completely agree with that, and I think that's another thing that also could be, because you have so much choice. You don't have so much choice, but you can artificially end the game. So I've done it because I didn't want to lose terribly. I was like, enough's enough, right?
Yeah, let's end this.
Let's end this. So I did that. And equally, it becomes really difficult to work out whether you are winning and whether you should call time or whether you should keep going and keep pushing.
Yeah.
Because actually, you use your popularity rating as a multiplier. And actually, that becomes really complicated because you got to do... Again, I'm not a fucking mentat. I can't work this out, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it almost that hidden VP value, I think, is really...
VP?
Victory point value is really useful in this, because it does sort of prevent people from knowing who's in the lead. I think I saw last time we played it, actually, there's a little variant in the rule book which basically says if somebody clearly spends more than 5 minutes trying to work out who's winning, there's massive penalties that you impose on them. Yeah. So the whole point, one of the points of the game is you should not be able to, at a glance at least, tell who's winning. Which I think is quite cool.
Except for our game the other night.
That was very, very, very clear.
As tears rolled down my cheeks.
I don't get to win many games, dear listeners. Hannah's a lot better at games than I am, so I just revelled in my victory the last time. So yeah, I mean, one thing we should talk about, I guess, in this is, as well as theme. while the core theme of this is an alternate history 1920s with mechs is cool, I was kind of expecting a bit more. Even the encounter cards don't really give you a scenario, they just give you an outcome. So the theme, despite the miniatures and despite the art style, actually feels quite light, which again is something I wonder if the campaign expansion would plug that hole as such. So yeah, I actually mark it down a little bit because of the theme. The theme's not as strong as I thought it would be.
Or you hoped it would be.
I hoped it would be, yeah. And because of that, there's very little emergent storytelling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll get to that, but yeah. So for me, I scored it a 5. I want to say that I do still enjoy playing it. I just got to be in the right headspace for it. If I've got a lot of stuff that's going on in my life, then it's probably not going to be the game that I pick. I've got to be in a good headspace for it. And I have had some amazing games that I've really enjoyed. It's just not what I would necessarily go to.
Okay. I scored an 8.
Yeah, that fits.
Yeah. Okay, so that gives us a general score of 6.5, but we always round up, so that will be a 7, which is the same as Marvel Champions, I believe, which is
No!
surprising, to say the least.
Maybe we're very inconsistent in our ratings.
Perhaps, or, I gave it a lot of 7s.
Yeah,
So
I gave
that's-
it a lot of 5s. Which I think is probably a fair split. Like,
You
like it a lot more than I do.
Yeah, you did give it 1/8, didn't you? Wasn't it?
Yes,
8?
components.
Yeah. Oh, that pushed it up there, didn't it? Okay, so go on to our couple/2-player ratings. The first one is table talk. So this is around dead time, getting to know the person, how much you chat and interact during the game.
Absolutely rubbish. Absolutely horrendous. And maybe this is because it's me, again, who sits there for a really long time working out what the fuck I'm going to do next. But absolutely no, there is no table talk.
I don't think it's just you on this occasion. I think it is a game that is very much around building your own engine, and the game doesn't force you to directly interact very much at all. There's no trading. There's very little combat there, particularly with 2 players. You can, if you start at the opposite end of the map, you can pretty much go the whole game without really having to encounter each other. You just sort of spread out in your own little area.
I think this is one of the things as well about it being us playing it as a 2-player. I think sometimes, and maybe it's because I haven't played it enough and I still obviously haven't got my head around it. Well, I don't think that's necessarily true. I need to pay more attention to what it is that other people are doing. I think the more players you had, the more you'd have to pay attention to what other people are doing.
Yeah, that's true.
I don't have the space for that.
It's the same with any game. You have to master your own play before you start paying too much attention to what other people are doing. Particularly with engine builders, you've got to get it working for you before you can even start thinking about counteracting or countering what somebody else is doing. I don't think, honestly, either of us are there yet with it.
No, but I think if you did go up to that level and you were like quite hardcore players, then you're going to have even less table talk because you're going to have to pay attention to what everybody else is doing.
Yeah.
So it is very much, I think, a solitary game rather than
one that sort of makes you interact.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what do you give it?
3, which I think is generous.
Okay. I gave it 5.
Okay.
All right. Okay, so then competitiveness.
So yes, you are competing against each other, but at the same time, if there's very little touch points, I think, in terms of, combat or vying for control of the board, then actually you don't really have that same level of competitiveness. I feel like I'm playing the game on my own and I've just got to beat your score rather than I'm actively fighting you.
Yeah, you see, I disagree with you here. I agree with you on the point around the interactivity, but I think we dealt with that in the last category. I think where the competitiveness of this comes is that core better score than you. And I think if you are playing with the same person and you're both into it and you keep playing it, I imagine by sort of game 20... some of the conflicts in terms of who does better could become rather epic, because as your skill and understanding of the game improves, I think the ceiling for how competitive you could theoretically get with this would be very, very high, because you'd start to become almost perfectionist with it. And
yeah, actually, and I probably agree with that. So again, I think the last game that we played was a bit of a a null for me.
Yeah.
But actually, when we really got into the swing of it, so we were actively both kind of, doing well, that was really quite cool, and that was quite fun.
Yeah, and I think as things develop, as your skill in it develop, because it is very sort of skill based, and you will get better at it the more you play it. I could see it becoming almost sort of chess-like, where you become very competitive with the other person you keep playing with, because you're at a similar skill level.
And actually, points in it, I imagine, can be quite small.
Yeah, I imagine the score gaps become smaller and smaller the more you play it. I think it is worth mentioning that it's one of those games that if one person played with the other, so if for instance I started playing it online or something like that, you would get a skill gap quite quickly. I think if you're going to embark on this journey as a two-player setup, you need to ensure that you're both playing it as much as each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because otherwise it would just turn into an absolute spanking every time you brought it to the table.
This is not the person that you've just met and been dating for 3 or 4 months and you want to introduce them to a game. This is not it.
Yeah, I mean, there's that element of it, but yeah, I think
unless maybe you like a good spanking, who knows?
Yeah, I mean, we don't king shame here. I think it is vitally important that somebody doesn't go off and play like 5 or 6 games without the other, because that will be it.
Yeah.
That will put a complete stop to it. So if there is a chance that you would play, one of you would play it with different people, or somebody's going to a board game night where they're playing it, it's probably not a good choice in that regard.
Agreed.
But that aside, I think the ceiling for the competitive nature of it around scoring at least is really high. So I've actually given it an 8.
So I gave it a 6.
Okay, all right. That kind of tracks with your sort of feelings and opinions of it. So yeah, fine. Final one is scalability and FOMO, fear of missing out. So this is where we look at a game and think, would it be better with more people? Are we missing something because we're not playing it with 3 or 4 or 5?
What I would say is this is probably one of the few games in our collection that we've not played with multiple.
No.
So we don't know this for certain. That said, part of me would really like to try it with more people.
I would agree. I think, just from my experience of board gaming, playing this, I imagine that 4 people is a sweet spot for this. Mm-hmm. It would force you to interact. It would add a lot more tactical depth to it. You'd
have to combat more because you would be fighting over for resources.
Yeah, and I think it would, if somebody did run away with it, like I did in our last game, I think that would be quite obvious that somebody else would try and scupper my plans a little bit, so it would have that bit of a foil, and you wouldn't have somebody just shooting off and just winning the game straight away. So in this case, I honestly do think it is crying out for more people.
However, what I would also say is that because there is a lot of dead time and because there isn't a huge amount of table talk, I think if I look at our friends and if I look at the way in which we play, my worry would be that what would happen is while you were taking your turn, me and somebody else would go off, we'd have a conversation, and because turns can take a while when you're me and you're thinking about it quite a lot, that actually you wouldn't necessarily all retain that same focus. I feel like it'd be really difficult to keep people on focus and on track.
I think it depends on the person. I think if somebody was into it, they'd very much want to pay attention to what somebody else was doing. So yeah, I'm not sure.
But that's not necessarily the way that board games always play when you're playing. Is
No, not necessarily. I think you would need somebody who was very into thinky Euro board games to keep them engaged. I think if you put this in front of somebody who's perhaps more sort of casual about the games that they play, I think they could potentially lose interest quite quickly. But again, it's dependent on the person, really, isn't it? Okay, I mean, for that I gave it a 4 because I do think it's crying out for people.
So I gave it a 4 as well, and I think we decided that we were going to score this low if we felt that actually
it was. We did feel like we were missing out a bit, which I do feel like we're missing out a bit with this one, playing it as a 2. So that gives us an overall 2-player / couple rating of 5.
Yeah,
which feels about right to me. I think it's a very good game. I don't think it is the best 2-player game.
No, absolutely agreed.
So, I mean, in general, quite a difference of opinion there. Won't be the last time, I'm sure. I do think we have different levels of affection for it, which is fair to say. But we do agree with its coupleability rating, for want of a better term, which is really what this podcast is about. If you are playing as a 2-player or couple, you might want to consider something else.
Yeah, unless perhaps maybe this actually scratches all your itches and you like...
we don't like to judge.
And if you like those kind of games where you're working quite separately and there's that huge amount of conversational dialogue, then maybe this is a game for you.
Yeah, perhaps. So, that brings us to the end of Scythe.
Scythe.
I'm going to put a Twitter poll up. Twitter poll mentioning there, if you want to interact with us, we have a Facebook group, we have our Twitter, we have our Insta, so please feel free to continue the conversation on there. I'd love to hear what you all think of this, if you've had similar experiences, or perhaps we are the outliers here and everybody thinks it's fantastic as a 2-player game. And if you listen to us on the podcast medium of choice, if you'd leave us a review, that would be very, very much appreciated. I think next time we are going to be talking about Stardew Valley.
Are we?
I think so.
Yes. I'm excited about that too.
So until next time, have fun, be good to each other, and play lots of games.